The United States is unique in that it really has two different immigration flows. Most countries, it's a question of who happens to be relatively proximate, and that limits the potential impact of immigration because, as a rule, countries that directly border each other tend to be of a similar socioeconomic status, and so you don't usually get a huge amount of flow between them. Now, the United States is different. Its immediate neighbor, Mexico, is a country with a significantly different socioeconomic structure. And as a result, we have a kind of a mentality in this country that most of the Mexicans that cross from Mexico to the United States tend to be less educated, less skilled, and so fill a very specific labor niche in the United States. It's not that assessment is entirely wrong. There's actually quite a bit to it, but it does forget a couple of very specific points that are unique to the North American geography and economy. First of all, Mexico is not a unified place. If you're talking about the part of Mexico that is more advanced, that does most of the manufacturing value added, the areas right around the core of Mexico City, they've got a much higher standard of living than Mexico as an average, and they're also far less likely to migrate. So the ones that kind of consider themselves the peers to the Americans, they don't move all that much. The people in Mexico and Central America who do relocate are the people from southern Mexico that are not really tightly integrated in the Mexican system. And these are the folks that kind of meet that mindset of relatively lower skilled, relatively lower paid. And they certainly make up the bulk of what we think of as the undocumented population here in the United States. Now, the United States still gets that second chunk of migration, relatively skilled people from the world over. In terms of numbers, it's smaller. In terms of educational levels, it's higher than the American average. So you got these two flows. Now play that across where we're going as a country and as a world. Skilled migration is primarily based on hardcore opportunity. Not so much, can I do better in this country than my current country, but can I do so much better that it is worth the upheaval that will hit my personal life?
Right.
That tends to be a smaller flow, and it tends to only happen in times of huge international upheaval. So we have not seen a lot of that since 1960. As the global order kicked in, the world kind of settled. The European and the Asian systems stopped fighting each other, and everyone saw some pretty broad-based economic growth. So we have seen our immigration of that, what we think of as top tier, I guess, become smaller and smaller and smaller as the years have gone on. That's about to change. As the Americans back away from the global order, the stability and wealth that has defined, especially places like Western Europe and the East Asian Rim, is going to go away. And we're going to see a huge surge in skilled, high-tier migration of the type that we have not seen in this country since the mid-1800s, when the Europeans were having all their civil wars, Germany in particular. So we're about to see a surge in what Donald Trump would consider good immigration, but it will happen because most of the world's catching on fire. The other half of that, the less skilled migration that's coming from southern Mexico and Central America, that's about to stop. And not because of a wall or harsh immigration policies or a little bit more funding to ICE. That's going to stop because of a demographic bust that's in progress. The developed world had a demographic bust that started, based on where you are, between 1970 and 1990. And that's one of the reasons why demographics in Japan and Germany are so atrocious. But it hit the developing world as well just 20 years later. So net migration from Mexico has actually been negative for 9 years now. And peak migration from Central America will probably happen next year. And it's only going to go down from there. When you're talking about the profile of migration that's hitting the United States, it's about to evolve substantially to something that's less familiar of us in our lives and something more familiar to something our great-grandparents would have recognized. We're going to see more Germans with doctorates and more French architects and more Chinese accountants coming in than unskilled day laborers. And that's going to change everything from the way our political system works to the way our real estate market. Well, even in a dull year, New York City has a lot going on. So let me try to kind of put this into a few basic buckets. Step one, New York City is either the number one or number two destination for capital flight into the United States. And that has pushed so much money into real estate that you've seen those sky-high prices. And because a lot of the higher-end condos are unoccupied because they're just designed to be sinks of value, you got a bubble. Eventually, people who are investing in that specific tier think that the prices have gotten too much and they go elsewhere. And that starts a bit of a cavalcade, and that's what we've seen in the last 12 months. So yes, the bubble is popping in New York City. It is affecting the upper end of the property spectrum. And all that's happened now is that the foreign money is relocating from New York to other cities, secondary cities. So we've probably seen the peak or the near peak in the gateway cities of Miami and Santa Monica and Seattle, San Francisco, and New York. And now we're seeing the money flow into the next wave, places like Charleston and Dallas-Fort Worth and Denver, places that most foreigners don't think of until they do a little bit of research. And they're like, oh, there's 4 million people there. I'll go there too. That's kind of piece one. Piece two, New York State, the Northeast in general, and New York City in specific have rapidly aging demographies.
Yeah.
They are not absorbing the number of youth in terms of immigration that they used to, and they're not generating their own. So it's actually the fastest aging part of the country. And that changes the profile of the real estate business, because if you don't have a lot of 20 and 30 somethings coming in and establishing themselves, then you don't have a growing real estate market from a demand perspective. And that will also tend to take some of the air out of the system. I don't mean to suggest that New York City is going to die or anything like that. This is not Detroit. But the broad-based dynamic growth that we're used to seeing in New York is something that is driven by factors that are no longer applying. And as New York City living costs continue to skyrocket, you're going to see more and more people relocating from the city to some place that they can actually afford to live. And that makes places that are outside of the city look more and more attractive. I mean, nobody moves to New Jersey because they love New Jersey. They move to New Jersey because they can afford to live in New Jersey. And this is another thing that is really strongly benefiting a lot of the secondary cities across the world and in the United States, because the advance of digital technologies are allowing people to work from more diversified location set. And that makes the concentration of capital and talent in New York not as important as it used to be. It's not that it's not a winning combination. It's just not critical like it used to be. And you're going to see that reflect in the real estate market as well. Then finally, manufacturing. New York has some of the world's more stringent regulations. It's not exactly a business-friendly place, because a lot of the environmentalism and activism that you see in New York City does not necessarily translate well to the rest of the state. New York City demographically, politically, really is the center of power of the state, but most people don't live in the rest of the state. So it's hard for the state to compete. Whereas if you move into, say, the South and Texas and the Great Plains, you get places that are much more eager to take steps to attract investment. And that makes it easier to really direct your manufacturing supply chains into different locations. And that makes places like Alabama look, honestly, a lot more attractive than places like New York State, when you're talking about the desire of kind of having a more broad-based economy with a more of a manufacturing base. New York is still great for services. It's still going to do well. It still has all the capital flight coming in from the rest of the world, but it is no longer the end-all and the be-all. One of the reasons that Texas succeeds when it comes to manufacturing is that Texans don't believe in government, like really at all. The state government here meets for 35 days every other year, and it's constitutionally prohibited from even considering legislation for the first half of that 35 days. The state footprint in Texas is nearly non-existent. Pretty much all the decisions are made at the local level. And if you get a local government that is willing to throw open the doors, that can work really, really well. But if you need, say, a light rail system, it's almost a disaster, because there's just no coordination among the governments, because there really aren't any governments. Let me start with the geographic story. Philly should be an economic powerhouse. It has deep water ocean access. It is proximate to some of the most densely populated parts of the United States. It has everything that it needs to thrive. But Philly has all of the negative aspects of what is going on with New York right now when it comes to immigration, population structure, and regulation, but none of the benefits. It's not a world-class city. It doesn't have those financial flows coming in. It doesn't have a property market that people think of as a sink of value. And so until you have policy changes in Philadelphia that allow it to take advantage of its physical location, you're going to continue to see the place hollow out. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, but that was probably the heyday. We've seen a series of regulations get adopted in Pennsylvania in general, and Philadelphia specifically, especially as regards environmental and union movements, that have pretty much driven everybody out. And it's under that same 50-year time span that the South has gone the opposite direction. And so anything where mobility is possible and the finance is flexible and regulations play a role, Philadelphia it seems to be intent to putting itself at the bottom of the list. And that has now been reflected for several decades.